It is the 31st of July, 1667, and in a Dutch town called Breda, a war is ending. It has been fought almost entirely at sea. 2 months earlier, a Dutch fleet sailed up an English river into the heart of England and burned the English navy where it lay at anchor. The English commissioners at the table are out of ships and out of money. They want peace, and they want it fast. So the terms are kept simple. Each side keeps what it is holding. The English are holding a small island at the mouth of a river in North America. They took it 3 years earlier without firing a shot from a Dutch governor with a wooden leg. It has a defensive wall along its northern edge, a good harbor, and about 1,500 people living behind it. The Dutch had called it New Amsterdam. The English have already renamed it New York. The Dutch are holding something else. 5 months before the negotiators sat down, a commander from Zeeland named Abraham Crynson sailed 3 ships into a brown river on the northeast shoulder of South America and took an English sugar colony off the men who had planted it. He renamed their fort after his own province. Then he sailed home to be told that a treaty was being drafted and that everything he had taken was now a bargaining chip. The Dutch negotiators do not hesitate. They understand precisely what sugar is worth. In Amsterdam alone, there are more than 50 refineries working. Coffee and tea are moving through Europe faster than anyone can supply them, and every cup of both wants sweetening. Sugar is the most profitable substance on Earth, and this new coast grows it in mud, so rich it does not need to be rested. An island with a wall on it cannot compete with that. So the Dutch keep the sugar coast, and they let Manhattan go. For 358 years, that decision has been repeated as a joke. The worst trade in recorded history. The Dutch swapped New York for a swamp. But nobody has ever really closed the ledger on it, and in 2028, 150 kilometers off the coast those men chose, something is going to start pumping that reopens the whole question. This is Suriname. It sits on the northeast shoulder of South America, with Guyana to the west, French Guiana to the east, and Brazil at its back. It is the smallest sovereign country on the continent, just under 164,000 square kilometers, which is roughly England and Scotland laid together, or the state of Georgia. About 640,000 people live in it. That is fewer people than live in a single mid-sized city almost anywhere else. And almost all of them live in one thin band along the top. The coastal plain is a strip of clay and mangrove and drained polder, no more than about 80 kilometers deep at its widest, flattening out into mudflats that the Atlantic pushes back and forth twice a day. That strip holds the capital, the ports, the rice fields, the last of the sugar, and something close to 9 out of every 10 Surinamese people. Everything south of that line is forest. 93% of this country is still under trees, not plantation trees, not recovering scrub, primary tropical forest, standing where it has stood since long before anyone wrote anything down about this place. It is the highest forest cover of any nation on Earth. The historic rate of clearance has run below 1/5 of 1% a year. Suriname absorbs more carbon than it releases. There are very few countries on this planet that can make that claim, and almost none of them made it on purpose. And yet, by every measure an economist uses, this is one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. In 2020, Suriname stopped paying its sovereign debt. By 2022, public debt had reached 117% of everything the country produced in a year. The currency fell. Prices in the shops in Paramaribo doubled and then kept moving. Nearly 1 in 5 people lives below the poverty line, and the number is higher in the interior, where the rivers flood and the roads do not reach. 3/4 of what Suriname sells to the world is gold and oil. That is not an economy. That is a lottery ticket held very tightly. Then, 150 kilometers off that coastal strip, in water between 100 and 1,000 meters deep, drillers found what was underneath. 2 fields, Sapakara and Krabdagu. Appraisal drilling put the recoverable oil in them at more than 750 million barrels. Light, sweet crude, cheap to lift, in the same geological basin that turned the country next door into the fastest-growing economy on Earth.
On the 1st of October
2024, in Paramaribo, the final investment decision was signed. $10.5 billion. The largest single investment ever made in this country by an enormous margin. A floating production vessel capable of 220,000 barrels a day, 32 new wells, first oil in 2028. The project has a name, Gran Morgu. It comes from Sranan Tongo, the language people actually speak on the streets here, and it means 2 entirely different things at the same time. We will come back to what they are. Which leaves one question standing over everything else in this country. Suriname has been wanted by outsiders for 358 years. Wanted for sugar, then for aluminium, then for gold, now for oil. Every single time, the thing of value was carried out. What happens the one time the wealth is supposed to stay? On the northeastern edge of Suriname, where the Maroons River widens and empties into the Atlantic, there is a stretch of beach called Galibi. It is not a spectacular coast. No cliffs, no white sand, no clear water. The sea here runs the color of weak coffee because the Amazon throws sediment north along this shore in a slow brown conveyor that has been running for millions of years. And every year, between roughly February and August, the largest reptile in the world climbs out of that brown water and hauls herself up the sand. A leatherback turtle can weigh over 500 kilograms. She has no hard shell. Her back is a ridged, rubbery carapace of oil-saturated tissue, which is why she can dive deeper than most whales and swim in water cold enough to kill any other reptile alive. She crosses entire oceans, eating almost nothing but jellyfish, and she has been doing it in more or less this form for close to 100 million years. Galibi is one of the most important leatherback nesting grounds in the Western Atlantic. What she does when she arrives is the part that matters. She does not choose a beach, she returns to one. Somewhere in her navigation, she carries the coast she hatched on, and after decades at sea, she comes back to the same few kilometers of sand to dig, lay, cover, and leave. She will never meet a single one of her offspring. The Kalina and Lakono people who live at the mouth of this river have watched this happen for longer than the country has had a name. Remember her. She is going to come back into this story at the end, and by then, the coast she is returning to will not be the same coast. 60 kilometers west of Galibi, the Suriname River comes down out of the forest and turns north for the sea. On its left bank stands a city that should not look the way it looks. Paramaribo was the administrative capital of the most profitable colony in the Dutch Atlantic Empire. For a century and a half, the wealth that moved through this river mouth was extraordinary. The plantations upstream were producing sugar, coffee, cotton, and cacao at a rate that made individual Amsterdam families permanently rich, and the capital they built with it is made of wood. Not partly, almost entirely. Walk the historic inner city today, and you are walking through several hundred timber buildings, most of them white, most of them 2 stories, with green shutters, high, steep roofs, and long verandas designed to move air through a room in a climate that sits at 30 degrees and 80% humidity most of the year. The brick foundations are Dutch. Everything above them is tropical hardwood cut from the forest behind the town. The St. Peter and Paul Cathedral, finished in 1885, is one of the largest wooden buildings in the Western Hemisphere. It has no stone in its structure at all. Inside, unpainted cedar rises into a vaulted ceiling that looks like the inverted hull of a ship, because the men who built it were shipwrights before they were carpenters. The whole inner city is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the reason given is precise. It is a European town plan built in Surinamese material by Surinamese hands. There is a corner of that inner city that people photograph more than any other. On Keizerstraat, a mosque stands beside a synagogue. Not near it, beside it. They share a boundary and a parking area. The Neve Shalom congregation has been on that ground since the early 1700s. The mosque next door serves the Ahmadiyya community, who arrived on this coast from Java much later, by an entirely different route for entirely different reasons. But it does raise a question that the buildings themselves cannot answer, and it is not a small one. How does a country of 600,000 people end up with a Jewish congregation, a Javanese Muslim congregation, Hindu temples, Moravian churches, and a Chinese quarter, all within about 15 minutes of one another on foot? Hold that. The answer is not in this city, it is in the fields upriver, and it takes about 200 years to arrive. At the eastern end of the old waterfront sits Fort Zeelandia. It is the oldest structure in the country. Crynson renamed it in 1667 when he took it from the English, and the Dutch enlarged it into the 5-pointed brick fortification that stands there now, looking out over the river it was built to control. For 3 centuries, it was the physical seat of colonial authority in Suriname. In 1982, it was used for something else. We will come to that. It is one of the 2 heaviest things in this country's modern memory, and it deserves to be told properly rather than in passing. For now, stand on the river wall and look south. Everything Paramaribo was built out of came down that river, and upriver is where you find the 90% of this country that almost nobody lives in, and the people who have been living in it on their own terms for longer than the United States has existed. But between the city and the forest, there is the coast that paid for both, and it has to be described honestly. East of Paramaribo, the Comawaina district is a flat green quilt of old plantation land, cut through by canals that are still perfectly straight 300 years after they were dug. From the air, you can read the estates like a document. Rectangles, drainage ditches, sluice gates, long access roads running back from the riverbank. At the confluence where the Comawaina meets the Suriname River, there is a fort. Its name is New Amsterdam. The Dutch built it in the 1740s to stop the French coming upriver, and they named it after the place they had traded away. The joke was not accidental. Sitting there now, on grass earthworks, looking at the water where both rivers merge, you are standing inside the punchline of the deal at Breda, told by the people who made it. What that fort was protecting was one of the deadliest places in the Americas. The sugar economy of Suriname ran on enslaved African labor, and it consumed that labor at a rate that is difficult to state without sounding like exaggeration. The work was cane. Cutting cane in a tropical wet season is among the hardest physical labor that has ever been organized at scale. Add malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, and a system of punishment designed to be witnessed, and the plantations did not sustain a population. They burned through one. Deaths outpaced births so consistently for so long that the colony could only continue by importing more people. Roughly 250,000 Africans were landed in Suriname across the trade. By 1863, when slavery was finally abolished here, the enslaved population was a fraction of that number. The arithmetic in that gap is the entire story of the coast. And abolition, when it came with a condition. Emancipation was declared in 1863, but the freed people of Suriname were required to remain on the plantations under state supervision for a further 10 years. Freedom was announced and then postponed. The real date on this coast is 1873, which is why, in this country, the celebration is not held on the day the law was passed. Keti Koti, the breaking of the chains, is the 1st of July, and the people who dance it in Paramaribo know exactly how much of it was paid for after the announcement. 30 kilometers upriver from the fort, on a low bluff above the water, there is a set of ruins in the forest that most Surinamese have never visited. It is 1685. On a sand ridge overlooking the Suriname River, a community of Sephardic Jews, most of them descended from families expelled from Portugal and Spain, then pushed out of Dutch Brazil when the Portuguese took it back, dedicate a synagogue. They call it Baraka Veshalom, blessing and peace. It is built of brick with a floor of sand in the Amsterdam style. It is one of the first purpose-built synagogues in the Americas. Around it, they lay out a village, a square, streets, houses, a cemetery whose stones carry Hebrew and Portuguese together. The place is called Joden Savanne, the Savannah of the Jews. It is granted an unusual degree of self-government by the colonial authorities, including its own militia and its own civil jurisdiction, because the Dutch want experienced sugar planters, and these families know sugar.
They also hold people in slavery.
That has to be said plainly. Joden Savanne was a plantation community, and its prosperity ran on the same arrangement as every other estate on this river. The village declined through the 1700s as the sugar economy shifted downriver. In 1832, it burned. The families left for Paramaribo, and the forest came back over the square and the streets and the houses. The brick walls of Baraka Veshalom are still standing, roofless, with trees growing where the congregation stood and the sand floor still visible between the foundations. In 2023, UNESCO added the site to the World Heritage List. Beyond the last plantation, the river changes. The water stops being brown and starts being black, stained the color of strong tea by tannins leaching out of leaf litter. The banks close in, the straight colonial canals end, and the river begins to behave like a river again, braiding around granite, dropping over ledges, running fast between boulders. And in that water lives an animal that only survives where the water is clean enough to hunt in. The giant river otter is the longest otter on Earth. A large male reaches nearly 1.5 meters before you count the tail, which adds most of another meter. He hunts by sight, underwater, at speed, taking fish with his front paws rather than his mouth, and he needs water clear enough to see through to do it. They live in families, a breeding pair and their offspring, sometimes 10 animals together, sharing a bank den and a stretch of river, hunting cooperatively and shouting at each other constantly. They are so noisy and so unafraid that Spanish speakers named them river wolf. They were hunted almost to nothing for their pelts through the middle of the 20th century. Thousands of skins a year moved out of the Amazon basin. The species is still listed as endangered, and the population trend across most of its range is down. The rivers of central Suriname hold some of the healthiest families left anywhere. Not because anyone protected them especially well, but because almost nobody went up there. Which brings us to the people who did. Follow the Suriname River south past the last road, and you enter a country that has never really been governed from the coast. Along the upper river, and along the Tapanahoni to the east, there are villages of open-sided houses on stilts, canoes drawn up on the sand, and paths running back into the trees toward garden plots cut and replanted on a rotation older than anyone can date. The people who live there are called Maroons. There are 6 distinct peoples. The Samaka and the Nduka are the largest, with roughly 50,000 people each. The Matawai, the Paramaka, the Aluku, and the Quinti are smaller, and the Quinti number only a few hundred. Every one of them descends from people who walked off the plantations and did not come back. Escape from a Suriname plantation was not like escape almost anywhere else in the Americas. There was no free territory to reach. There was no border to cross. There was only forest immediately in every direction, and the forest was the reason it worked. Behind the coastal strip lies a wall of tropical rainforest that a colonial militia could not march through, could not supply itself in, and could not navigate without the very people it was hunting. So the escaped communities went upriver, and they built something new out of what they had carried in their heads. What they built is one of the most remarkable acts of cultural construction in the history of the hemisphere. The people arriving in those first villages came from different parts of West and Central Africa, spoke different languages, and held different systems of belief. Within 2 or 3 generations, they had produced new languages, Samakatongo and Nduka among them, new religious practice, new law, a paramount chief called a Ghanman, and matrilineal clans that still organize land and inheritance today. None of that was preserved. All of it was made. The colony tried to destroy them for the better part of a century. Expeditions went upriver and came back with almost nothing. In 1754, one final campaign of 500 men was launched with orders to force a permanent peace or else find the Maroons and finish them. It failed, like the others. So the Dutch did the only thing left. On the 10th of October, 1760, the colonial government signed a treaty with the Nduka. 2 years later, in 1762, it signed one with the Samaka. A third followed with the Matawai in 1767. The treaties recognized the Maroons as free. They granted them territory in the interior. They granted them the right to trade and to carry arms.
That is 101 years
Before slavery was abolished in this country. These communities negotiated their own freedom as a sovereign matter from a colonial state that had spent decades trying to exterminate them. And the treaties carried a clause that has never stopped being difficult. In exchange for peace, the Maroons agreed to stop raiding the plantations and to return anyone who escaped to them in future. That is the price that was set. It was accepted by leaders who had watched their people die for 50 years, and it bound the free to hand back the unfree. Both of those things are true, and the second one does not cancel the first. Not everyone signed. In the 1770s, a man named Boney led a war against the colony from the eastern forests along the Kotika and the Maroons. He had been born on a plantation to an enslaved mother. He was fighting after the treaties, which meant he was fighting the colonial militia and, at times, treaty-bound Maroons sent against him under the terms of those agreements. The Dutch imported European mercenaries specifically to deal with him. It took them years. The people who came out of that war are the Aluku, and they carry his name still. There is a name I want to leave here because it comes back. Ganzi. A Samaka village on the upper river, about 1,200 people, one of the larger settlements on the water. Hold on to it. In 1964, it stopped existing, and the reason it stopped existing is one of the most revealing things that has ever happened in this country. West of the Samaka villages, the forest stops being a place people pass through and becomes something else entirely. The Central Suriname Nature Reserve covers 1.6 million hectares. That is 16,000 square kilometers of unbroken primary rainforest, protecting the upper watershed of the Kopanam River and the headwaters of 5 others. It is one of the largest tracts of undisturbed tropical forest under formal protection anywhere on the planet, and there are no roads into it. You arrive by river, or you arrive by small aircraft, or you do not arrive. Out of that canopy rise granite domes. The Voltsberg is the best known, a bare rock shoulder 240 meters high, pushed up out of the Guiana Shield, which is some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth. Climb it at dawn, and there is nothing in any direction but forest and mist, sitting in the low ground like water. Botanists have collected more than 5,000 vascular plant species inside the reserve. 400 bird species have been recorded. Much of it has still never been systematically surveyed, which means nobody can tell you what the real number is. And here is the question that should be asked about all of it. Why is any of this still here? The answer is uncomfortable because it is not virtue, it is arithmetic. 640,000 people, more than half of them in one coastal city, on a landmass the size of England and Scotland. There has never been enough population pressure to push a farming frontier south. The rivers are broken by rapids, so timber is expensive to move. And for most of the 20th century, the money here came from digging holes in a few specific places rather than from converting land. Suriname did not save its forest. Suriname was never in a position to spend it, which is exactly why the next 20 years matter so much. Circumstance is not a policy. A country that keeps its forest because it cannot afford to clear it is one windfall away from finding out whether it ever meant it. Above that canopy, there is a bird almost nobody ever sees. The harpy eagle is the most powerful bird of prey in the Americas. A large female weighs 9 kilograms, with a wingspan of just over 2 meters, which is not the widest in the world, and the reason for that is deliberate. A long wing is useless inside a forest. Hers are short and broad, built for turning hard through a canopy at speed. Her talons are the part that stops people mid-sentence. The rear talon, on a full-grown female, measures up to 12.5 centimeters, longer than the claw of a grizzly bear, with grip strength behind it enough to crush bone outright. She takes sloths and howler monkeys off branches and carries them away without landing. She raises one chick every 2 to 3 years. One. The pair keep feeding it for months after it can fly, which is why the species cannot absorb losses. A harpy eagle needs several thousand hectares of continuous canopy, and when the canopy breaks, she does not adapt to the fragments. She simply is not there anymore, which makes her the most honest instrument in this country. Where the harpy eagle still nests, the forest is genuinely intact. Where she has gone, something has already happened, whether or not it is visible from the air. And in 1964, in the eastern forest, something happened that was visible from a very long way up. It is the 1st of February, 1964. At a place called Afobaka on the Suriname River, a dam is closed. It is 1,900 meters long and 54 meters high, built by a subsidiary of an American aluminium company. Bauxite is Suriname's export, and turning bauxite into aluminium takes enormous quantities of electricity. The dam will produce 180 megawatts. 3/4 of it goes straight to the smelter. The gates come down. The river stops. Behind the wall, water begins to spread out across the forest floor, and it does not stop spreading for 7 years. The reservoir that formed covers 1,560 square kilometers, close to 1% of the entire country. Drowned trees still stand in it in grey ranks, and the fishermen who work it navigate between them from memory. By the measure the World Bank later applied, it flooded more land per megawatt of power than any other large dam ever assessed. 160,000 hectares of forest for 180 megawatts. It also drowned the villages. About 6,000 Samaka people were living on that stretch of river. Their houses, their gardens, their cemeteries, and their shrines went under. They were moved downstream into new settlements built for them, several of which were given the same names as the places that no longer existed, which is its own particular kind of cruelty. The largest village lost was Ganzi, 1,200 people. It is under about 40 meters of water. There is one detail from all of this that keeps being repeated, because it says everything without needing a conclusion attached to it. As the water rose, thousands of animals were stranded on shrinking islands of high ground. The government asked an international animal welfare organization for help, and in March 1964, a field officer named John Walsh arrived. He assembled a team of 42 local men, most of them Samaka, and for the next 18 months, they went out in boats, caught animals off drowning islands, and carried them to dry forest. They saved close to 10,000 of them: deer, tapirs, ocelots, sloths, anteaters, 8 species of monkey, tortoises, anacondas. It became the first disaster rescue operation that organization ever ran. The operation was called Gwamba, which in Samakatongo means game or meat. More money was spent moving the 10,000 animals than was spent moving the 6,000 people. That is the clearest single statement of how this country's interior was regarded by the men making decisions about it. Not malice, something colder than malice. A calculation in which the forest was an asset, the animals were a matter of public relations, and the villages were a line item. The forest that received those animals holds something small enough to sit on a coin. In the far south, near the Brazilian border, the trees open out into the Sipaliwini savanna, and in a fragment of forest inside that grassland lives a frog the color of a gas flame. The dying poison frog, the population known as Azurius, is a deep, saturated blue with black spots, about 4 centimeters long, and it makes no attempt to hide. Everything about it is an advertisement. The color warns that its skin carries alkaloid toxins, absorbed from the ants and mites it eats, concentrated and stored where a predator will find them on the first attempt, and never make a second. What makes this particular population remarkable is where it sits. It is stranded. When the climate dried after the last glacial period, the forest retreated and left islands of trees marooned in open savanna, and the frogs inside those islands were cut off from every other population of their species. They have been evolving alone ever since, in a patch of forest a person could walk across in an afternoon. The male carries the tadpoles up one at a time on his back, from the leaf litter into pools of water held in bromeliads, and leaves each one in its own small, private ocean. And in the same forest, about 200 kilometers north of it, men are pulling gold out of the ground with mercury. Suriname is the greenest country on Earth by proportion of forest cover. That is the fact everyone leads with, and it is true. Suriname also consumes more than 50 tons of mercury a year, and specialists believe effectively all of it now enters the country illegally. Both of those sentences describe the same place in the same year. Here is how they fit together. Small-scale gold mining works by washing sediment and then adding mercury, which binds to the gold particles and forms an amalgam that can be lifted out. The miner then burns the amalgam. The mercury vaporizes, the gold stays behind, and the vapor goes into the air, into the rain, into the rivers, and into the fish. Once it is in water, bacteria convert it into methyl mercury, which moves up the food chain and concentrates at every step. Communities on the interior rivers who eat fish daily because there is nothing else to eat daily carry some of the highest mercury burdens ever measured in South America. The mining strips the forest first. A working pit is a grey moonscape of tailings and standing orange water in the middle of intact canopy, visible from orbit as a spreading scar along the rivers. And it is not a marginal activity. Gold is one of the two things this country sells. It employs tens of thousands of people, many of them Maroons whose land it is, many of them Brazilian migrants who came north for it, and it operates in a regulatory space so thin that establishing who owns any individual operation is often impossible. Then there is the other coast. Not the eastern one, where the turtles come ashore, the western one, where the rice is. It is the 5th of June, 1873. A ship called the Lala Rook comes up the Suriname River and ties up at Paramaribo. On board are 399 people from northern India. They have signed indenture contracts, 5 years of labor on the plantations, a fixed wage, and a return passage at the end of it. The date is not a coincidence. It is the year the 10-year apprenticeship finally expires, and the planters know the freed people of this coast are about to walk off the estates. So a new labor supply is arranged. Over the following decades, around 34,000 people arrive from India. From 1890, tens of thousands more arrive from Java, then part of the Dutch East Indies, on the same kind of contract. Chinese laborers had come earlier. Lebanese traders followed later. Most of them did not take the return passage. They took land instead in the western districts, and they planted rice. Nickerie today is water and green blades running flat to the horizon, sluices and pumping stations, and dead-straight canals. The road signs are in Dutch, the conversations in the market are in Suriname and Javanese and Suriname Tongo, sometimes inside the same sentence. And that is the answer to the corner on Keizerstraat. The mosque stands beside the synagogue because a Sephardic community fled Iberia in the 1500s, and a Javanese Muslim community was recruited off Dutch-controlled Java in the 1890s, and both of them ended up on the same riverbank, brought there by the same empire 3 centuries apart for the same reason. Somebody needed labor and capital in a place that could not produce its own. Every community in Suriname is here because of an extraction economy. The indigenous peoples were here first and were pushed to the edges of it. Africans were brought in chains to cut cane. Indians and Javanese were contracted to replace them. Chinese and Lebanese families came to trade with all of them. The Dutch came for sugar. 6 languages, 5 religions, and a food culture that runs from roti to pom to bami. All of it assembled by accident, by an economy that wanted hands and got people instead. It held together better than almost anyone had a right to expect. And then, in 1980, it came apart. Suriname became independent from the Netherlands on the 25th of November, 1975. In the years around that date, roughly 1/3 of the entire population left for the Netherlands. They were entitled to Dutch passports. They did not trust what was coming, and they were right. On the 25th of February, 1980, 16 sergeants overthrew the elected government. The constitution was suspended. Parliament was dissolved. A sergeant major named Desi Bouterse emerged from the group as the man who actually held the country. On the night of the 7th of December, 1982, soldiers went to 13 houses in Paramaribo between 2 and 5 in the morning and took 13 men out of their beds. 2 more were brought from prison. 15 in total. Lawyers, journalists, university teachers, trade union leaders, a former footballer, an army officer.
They were driven to Fort Zeelandia,
The brick fort on the waterfront that Kreinsen had renamed 315 years earlier. They were questioned by a court that had appointed itself. They were tortured. Then they were shot. 2 days later, Bouterse said on national television that they had been killed trying to escape. The Netherlands and the United States suspended aid within weeks, and the economy, which had been running on Dutch development money, fell over. Then, the interior went to war. In July 1986, a former presidential bodyguard named Ronnie Brunswick attacked an army post in the east with a group that became known as the Jungle Commando, most of them Nduka Maroons. What began as a personal quarrel became a 6-year conflict along the eastern rivers. In November 1986, soldiers went into the Nduka village of Moiwana and killed at least 39 people. Most of them were women and children. In 2005, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights found the state responsible and ordered reparations. Moengo, the bauxite town on the Kotika, emptied. Tens of thousands of Maroons crossed the river into French Guiana and did not come back for years. The east of the country still carries it. The fighting formally ended in 1992. Bouterse went on to be convicted in a Dutch court of drug trafficking in 1999, elected president of Suriname in 2010, convicted again at home in 2019 for the December killings, and he died in hiding in the forest in 2024, still a fugitive from a sentence upheld by his own country's courts. It is difficult to overstate what 4 decades of that does to a state. Not just the deaths, the institutions. Nobody builds a functioning tax authority or a regulator that survives a change of government while all of that is happening. The country arrived in the 2020s owing more than it produced, with 2 exports, and with a memory that made every citizen suspicious of anyone promising the money would be shared. That memory is not paranoia. It is a correctly drawn conclusion from 350 years of evidence. There is a way the world writes about countries like this, and it is worth naming before the last part of the story because the framing does real damage. The first version is the tragedy, a small, poor place with a violent past, permanently unfortunate, best understood as a warning. The second version is the miracle, a small, poor place about to be transformed by a discovery, best understood as a lottery winner. Both versions have the same defect. In both of them, the country is passive. Things happen to it. Nobody in it is a decision maker, and nothing that happens next has anything to do with what the people already living there choose. So, here is a different framing. There are Surinamese institutions that have made decisions in the last 20 years, and the results are on record. In 2007, 2 Samaka leaders named Hugo Jabini and Wanze Edwards finished a case they had spent a decade building. Their government had been selling logging and mining concessions on Samaka territory without asking anyone who lived there. On the 28th of November, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled that the Samaka hold collective title to their lands and that the state cannot grant concessions over resources there without their free, prior, and informed consent. It was the first time a court had ruled that a people who are not indigenous to a place could hold indigenous rights in it, on the grounds that they had built a distinct society with its own language, law, and relationship to the land. That judgment now protects Maroon and tribal communities across the hemisphere. The descendants of people who negotiated their freedom out of a colonial government in 1760 went back into a courtroom 247 years later and did it again. Which brings us, finally, out past the mangroves. 150 kilometers north of the Suriname coast, the seabed drops away from 100 meters to 1,000. This is Block 58, and it sits in the same geological basin as the block next door in Guyana, where an American supermajor found something close to 11 billion barrels. In 2021, the drillers here found oil. Then they found more. The appraisal campaign finished in 2023 and confirmed 2 fields, Sapakara and Krabdagu, holding more than 750 million barrels of recoverable crude between them. On the 1st of October 2024, in Paramaribo, the chief executive of Total Energies flew in personally to hand the field development plan to the president of Suriname. $10.5 billion, a floating production, storage and offloading vessel rated at 220,000 barrels a day, 32 new wells, an all-electric drive configuration, 0 routine flaring, and full re-injection of the associated gas back into the reservoir, with an emissions ceiling of 18 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per barrel. Lifting costs projected under $20 a barrel. Construction takes about 4 years. First oil is expected in 2028. Between $1 and $1.5 billion of that investment is contracted to be spent inside Suriname, and the projection is more than 6,000 direct, indirect, and induced jobs. Paramaribo becomes the operational and logistics center for the whole field, and after production begins, the majority of the net income goes to the state. Royalties, profit oil, and taxes. Depending on where the oil price sits, the state's own estimate across the life of the field is somewhere between $16 and $26 billion. The entire economy of Suriname is currently worth about $6 billion a year. Now the name. Gran Morgu is Sranan Tongo, and it holds two meanings at once. The first is the Goliath grouper, a fish that lives in the coastal waters here, grows to enormous size, lives for decades, and is said by some Amerindian and Caribbean communities to carry supernatural power. The second meaning is a great morning, a new dawn. A company named a $10 billion oil field after sunrise, in a language invented by enslaved people so they could speak to one another across languages their owners had separated them by, which closes the ledger that opened at Breda. In 1667, Dutch negotiators looked at a walled island in North America and a mud coast in South America and decided that the mud coast was worth more. For 358 years, that choice has been the standard example of getting it catastrophically wrong. They were not wrong about the value, they were wrong about who it would go to. Sugar made Amsterdam rich, and Suriname buried the people who cut it. Bauxite made an aluminium company profitable, and Suriname got a flooded valley and a drowned village called Ganzi. Gold moved through the shops in Paramaribo in canvas bags, and Suriname got mercury in its rivers and holes in its forest. Every previous time, the wealth was real. It simply left. In 2028, for the first time in 3.5 centuries, the largest thing this country has ever produced is scheduled to be owned, taxed, and banked by the country producing it. Nobody in Paramaribo is treating that as settled. Next door, Guyana went from first oil to the fastest-growing economy on Earth in under a decade. Gross domestic product per person went from about $6,000 to about $34,000 in 6 years. The poverty rate has stayed near 58%. The lesson from that is not that oil fails. The lesson is that the money arriving and the money reaching people are two separate events, and the second one only happens if institutions make it happen. Suriname's parliament passed 2 laws in December 2024 before a single barrel had been lifted. One sets fiscal rules, binding the government to a public debt target and to annual limits on spending. The other rebuilds the Savings and Stabilization Fund so that revenue arriving in a good year cannot simply be spent in that year. The current president, Jennifer Geerling-Simons, a medical doctor who sat in Parliament through the worst of the Botha period, has said in public that if the country does not prepare properly, it will suffer the resource curse. That is an unusual thing to say out loud about money that has not arrived. Whether any of it holds is the open question. Fiscal rules have escape clauses. Stabilization funds have been raided in other countries before, and the same government has pledged to protect at least 90% of the national forest permanently, while the mercury keeps coming in and the pits keep widening. Suriname is about to find out what it actually values, with enough money in the room for the answer to be expensive. Go back to the coast at the end of the dry season, when the mudflats west of the river mouth are exposed and the light goes flat and gold across them. The scarlet ibis comes in to roost. They fly in loose formation, low over the water, and the color is difficult to believe the first time you see it, a deep arterial red that comes entirely from the crustaceans they take out of the mud. A chick hatches gray. It earns the color by eating the coast. They arrive in the hundreds, settling into the mangroves until the branches look like they are burning. 20 kilometers out from where those birds are feeding, the survey vessels have already been over the seabed. And in a few months, on the beach at Galibi, the leatherback will come out of the water again. She has been doing this since long before there was a coast in this shape, before the Colina, before the plantations, before Kreinsen. She has no interest in any of it. She digs, she lays, she covers, and she goes back into the brown water. The thing about this country is that it has always been valued from somewhere else, by men in a Dutch town who never saw it, by a company that wanted electricity for a smelter, by buyers who wanted the gold and did not ask where it came from. Every valuation of Suriname on record has been made by people who intended to leave. In 2028, the valuation gets made here. Maybe it goes the way of Guyana, where the numbers rose and the poverty did not fall. Maybe the fiscal rules hold and the fund fills, and a generation of Surinamese children get schools their parents did not have. Maybe the forest survives the money, and maybe it does not. Nobody knows. The oil is still under 1,000 meters of water and 4 years of construction, and this is a country that has been promised things before. But for the first time since the 31st of July, 1667, the question of what this place is worth is being asked by the people who live in it. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you would like to keep exploring places like this one, subscribe, and we will see you on the next journey.